Tuesday, November 12. The Unwitting Witness of Pilate. Time and again, John records the attempts of the religious leaders to seize Jesus, to bring him to trial, and to sentence him to death. A theme in John's Gospel, stated often by Jesus, is that his time or hour had not yet come, by which he meant the time for his crucifixion. We read about that so many times. John chapter 2, verse 4. "Woman, why do you involve me?" Jesus replied, "My hour has not yet come." And John 7, verses 6 and 8. "Therefore the Lord said to them, My time is not yet here, for you any time will do. You go to the festival. I am not going up to this festival, because my time has not yet come." And verse 30. At this they tried to seize him, but no one laid a hand on him, because his hour had not yet come. And John chapter 12, verse 7. "Leave her alone," Jesus replied. "It was intended that she should save this perfume for the day of my burial." And verse 23, Jesus replied, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified." And John chapter 12 and verse 27, "Now my soul is troubled, and what shall I say? Father, save me from this hour. No, it was for this very reason I came to this hour." And John 13 verse 1. It was just before the Passover festival. Jesus knew that the hour had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father. Having loved his own who were in the world, he loved them to the end. And chapter 17, verse 1. After Jesus said this, he looked toward heaven and prayed, "Father, the hour has come. Glorify your Son, that your Son may glorify you." Now the hour had come. Jesus was arrested in the Garden of Gethsemane, brought before Annas, then Caiaphas the high priest, then twice before Pilate. John has called upon many witnesses from every walk of life to testify that Jesus was the Christ. Now John calls upon Pilate, the governor who tried Jesus. This was an important testimony because Pilate was a Roman, a governor, and a judge. Most of the other witnesses were Jews and commoners. How is Pilate's verdict connected to the theme of John's Gospel? John 18:38. "What is truth?" retorted Pilate. With this he went out again to the Jews, gathered them, and said, "I find no basis for a charge against him." And then we read John chapter 19, verses 4 to 22. Once more, Pilate came out and said to the Jews gathered there, "Look, I am bringing him out to you to let you know that I find no basis for a charge against him." When Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, Pilate said to them, "Here is the man." As soon as the chief priests and their officials saw him, they shouted, "Crucify! Crucify!" But Pilate answered, "You take him and crucify him. As for me, I find no basis for a charge against him." The Jewish leaders insisted, "We have a law, and according to that law he must die, because he claimed to be the Son of God." When Pilate heard this, he was even more afraid. And he went back inside the palace. "Where do you come from?" he asked Jesus. But Jesus gave him no answer. "Do you refuse to speak to me?" Pilate said. "Don't you realize I have power either to free you or to crucify you?" Jesus answered, "You would have no power over me if it were not given to you from above. Therefore, the one who handed me over to you is guilty of a greater sin." From then on, Pilate tried to set Jesus free. But the Jewish leaders kept shouting, "If you let this man go, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who claims to be a king opposes Caesar." When Pilate heard this, he brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat at a place known as the Stone Pavement, which in Aramaic is Gabbatha. It was a day of preparation of the Passover. It was about noon. "Here is your king," Pilate said to the Jews. But they shouted, "Take him away! Take him away! Crucify him!" "Shall I crucify your king?" Pilate asked. "We have no king but Caesar," the chief priests answered. Finally, Pilate handed him over to them to be crucified. So the soldiers took charge of Jesus. Carrying his own cross, he went out to the place of the skull, which in Aramaic is called Golgotha. There they crucified him, and with two others, one on each side, and Jesus in the middle. Pilate had a notice prepared and fastened to the cross. It read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." Many of the Jews read this sign, for the place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and the sign was written in Aramaic, Latin, and Greek. The chief priests of the Jews protested to Pilate, "Do not write the King of the Jews, but that this man claimed to be King of the Jews." Pilate answered, "What I have written, I have written." Jesus was brought to Pilate early on Friday morning, as we read in verse 28 of chapter 18. His plan was to dispatch the prisoner quickly to his fate. But Jesus' demeanour drew Pilate's attention. The governor questioned Jesus closely and heard from his lips, "For this purpose I was born, and for this purpose I have come into the world to bear witness to the truth. Everyone who is of the truth listens to my voice," Jesus had said in John 18:37. Though the governor ultimately condemned Jesus to death, he nonetheless 3 times proclaimed Jesus innocent, in chapter 18, verse 38, and in chapter 19, verses 4 and 6. And over the cross he wrote the words, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews," in chapter 19, verse 19, completing his witness to who Jesus is. And yet, despite his testimony of Christ's innocence, he nevertheless condemned Jesus to death. Pilate had the truth himself standing before him, and yet, allowing the mob to bully him, Pilate sentenced Jesus to death anyway. What a tragic example of not following what your conscience and heart tell you is correct. And so to finish today, what can we learn from Pilate's example about the dangers of allowing popular sentiment, even pressure, to keep us from doing what we believe is right? This lesson was read by Dr. Percy Harrold for Christian Services for the Blind. Sponsored by the Sabbath School Department and distributed through Hope Channel Australia, this podcast is also redistributed by Hope Channel Germany, Christian Record Services for the Blind. It is also available on SoundCloud and through multiple podcast distributors, including Apple iTunes. And you can listen and watch at the same time on YouTube. Remember, God is always faithful.